Media Broadcasting Center.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host for the second hour, the new JFK Show. Gary's on vacation in Mexico, and others are preoccupied. So what I want to do is offer the sixth installment of my multi-part response to the attack by Jim DiEugenio, published on Citizens for Truth about the Kennedy assassination, where it seems to me he's been particularly rash and impulsive in attacking me on a host of issues where he's never done any research himself, and he's been depending upon shills and trolls who are well known for attacking me, most of whom, if not all, I have previously exposed. So we'll continue today by beginning with some loose ends in relation to how it was done in New York, where they discovered that it was impossible to get a real plane into the towers, and therefore they had to fake it. Here there are many theories advanced on YouTube, but where it seems to me the most responsible explanation has come from Richard D. Hall with his Flight 175 radar 3D analysis you can find online, where he tracked down what appeared to be radar studies and discovered that there were two paths, that there was a military radar path that was some 1,400 feet to the right of the civilian radar path, which you can see here, and where the civilian radar path, which he had put together by plotting locations and times for some 27 of the 52 videos, where those 27 were sufficiently clear and precise to plot locations and times, where he discovered NIST had a similar plot claiming it was based on radar data, but where he did not find what they claimed to be their source plausible, subsequently discovering that there actually was radar data, but was for a plane that was 1,400 feet to the right of the plane seen in the plots, viewed from on the videos. So that what we have here is an explanation that the plane was projecting the image to its left, which would account for the impossible impact physics, that it had to fly faster than aerodynamically possible at that altitude in order to preserve the integrity of the holographic image, and that military data didn't detect the observed image because it was only a holograph, but only recorded the flight of the military plane that was making the projection. Where here you see the basic theory of how it was done. The plane on the right projecting the image on the left right into the building and creating the impression thereby of a plane having effortlessly entered the building. I subsequently obtained an airborne holographic projector from a military manual from Australia. A holographic projector displays a three-dimensional visual image in a desired location, removed from the display generator. The projector can be used for psychological operations and strategic perception management. It's also useful for optical deception and cloaking, providing a momentary distraction when engaging an unsophisticated adversary. This appears to be exactly what was done in New York. And indeed, we have the plane approaching. Then we have the massive fireball after it's completed its entry into the building, whereas I have previously explained it passes its entire length into this massive building and the same number of frames it passes through its entire length in air, which is a physical absurdity unless a massive 500,000-ton steel and concrete building provides no more obstacle to the trajectory of an aircraft than air. Obviously an absurdity. Now, the dangler, what I left missing in terms of an explanation, were the cutouts on the facades, one of which you see here for the North Tower. Now, we have these clearly are real physical effects, and the question becomes what caused them. If you peer into these gashes, there's no signs of any aircraft there whatsoever. And the way they're cut out is very, very odd. Notice the straight lines and so forth, very, very strange. Here is a silhouette for the northeast perimeter walls from floors 93 through 98. and the South Tower's perimeter walls from floor 78 through 82. Now, students have observed that when you have the initial impact based upon the Naudet brothers video on the left, it appears to create an elongated Z. But when you actually have the smoke clear, it turns out to be an expanded V, which is very odd in and of itself. Here is a very striking phenomenon in relation to the North Tower. You have all this dust and debris. So the plane, of course, has officially already hit the building. This is therefore a special effect, since what actually entered the building was a holographic projection, as Richard Hall has explained. Now, Ace Baker observed that when planes pass through clouds or smoke, they create what's known as wind or wing vortex, like a miniature tornado. But that in the case of the North Tower, there is no wind or wing vortex, indicating that no plane had actually passed there, but only the image of a plane. Powerful proof in and of itself. In addition, Jack White observed that in the Naudet frame of the impact, there's an extension in the later photograph. They went back and touched it up so that the right tip of the wing would be an added special effect. Now, what he discovered is that it appears to have been done with a very sophisticated arrangement of some kind of incendiary, internal or external to the building to create those cutouts. And it appears that it was done by a group of Israeli art students who were inhabiting the North and the South Tower, known as the Gelatin Group. They were conducting performance art external to the building. They had a device you can see here in the circle just to the right that they were using externally. Here you have a photograph internal that turns out to be revealing, and one of them external to the building. What we have here is some members of the Gelatin Group looking out of the building. And you'll notice those boxes beside them. Here's one of their efforts at performance art external to the building. But what is more important is this. These boxes of BB-18, many of them in each of the buildings, which turned out to be fuse holders. BB-18, power bar, bus bar, safe distribution of power to multiple fuse holders in a compact design is a key objective for panel designers. The little fuse UL508 bus bar system eliminates most wire terminations in a time-saving package. It appears they use these little power bars to arrange them in a pattern external to the building that would create the impression of the cutouts behind the smoke and debris, so that although you can't see the twinkling here, in Richard D. Hall's Flight 175 3D radar study, you can see behind the dust a lot of little sparkling points of light, leading me to ask whether this is what George Herbert Walker Bush meant by his 1,000 points of light. This appears to be the manner in which those cutouts were created on the facades of the building, which of course was not done by real planes, since no real plane could have entered the building, and what they used instead were holographic projections. Indeed, as I previously explained, 2 of these flights were not even in the air that day, 11 North Tower and 77 the Pentagon. That the pilots for 9/11 Truth have discovered that Flight 93 was over Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, after it had purportedly crashed in Shanksville, and that Flight 175 was over Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, long after it had purportedly hit the South Tower, where I've also obtained FAA registration data shown here, revealing that the plane that was used for Flight 175 in the South Tower was not formally taken out of service until 28 September 2005, and that the plane that was used for United 93 in Pennsylvania likewise was not taken out of service until that same date, 28 September 2005, raising the questions, how can planes that weren't even in the air have crashed on 9/11? And how can planes that crashed on 9/11 have still been in the air 4 years later? We've been subjected to an elaborate charade. Consider, if no planes crashed, then no passengers aboard those planes died from crashes that did not take place. And no Islamic hijackers caused them to crash. And if no Islamic hijackers caused them to crash, then there was no warrant or any justification for the war on terror. The American people have been scammed big time. This was an elaborate charade brought to us compliments of the CIA, the neocons in the Department of Defense, most of whom had come from Project for the New American Century, most of whom were dual U.S.-Israeli citizens, and the Mossad. Bear in mind, as David Ray Griffin reports in his magisterial work, the 9/11 Commission report, Omissions and Distortions, a half a dozen or more of these alleged suicide hijackers turned up the following day and were interviewed by news outlets in the United Kingdom. It was a huge fraud, an enormous charade. The American people were played for saps. Now, to give DiEugenio's actual criticism, to articulate it so we can understand exactly what he's claiming. Fetzer's colossal ambition also made him enter the Robert Kennedy assassination field. Again, this was a bit odd because Fetzer showed no credentials on being an authority in this area. The RFK community is much more narrowly populated than the JFK case, so it's quite hard not to bump into someone who has been tilling that same field. I had been involved in RFK studies for a period of about 3 years at the turn of the millennium. It's a very interesting area of endeavor, the main reasons being that, one, the case is even more clearly a conspiracy than the JFK case, and two, the subject of post-hypnotic suggestion is an utterly fascinating study. It's so fascinating, in fact, that one can get sidetracked by it and have a hard time making a U-turn out. Fetzer entered this field in a roundabout way. To my knowledge, he had never done any notable or original work on RFK, and in November 2006, author and documentary filmmaker Shane O'Sullivan went on the BBC network. O'Sullivan had been at work researching the RFK case for a possible screenplay. This eventually turned into both a book, Who Killed Bobby, and a documentary, RFK Must Die. But back in 2006 on the BBC, he was an interview guest. In his research, he said he had discovered that there were 3 CIA officers at the Ambassador the night Bobby Kennedy was murdered. He had obtained photos of these men, and enough witnesses had identified them that he was now going public with their identities. He said they were George Ioannidis, David Morales, and Gordon Campbell. Well, once again, of course, DiEugenio simply doesn't know my background. I'm very familiar with one of the key witnesses in this case, who is Bradley Ayers. He was an Army captain who was assigned to the CIA. He was stationed in at W. Wave down in Miami, the only CIA post ever officially located on the continental United States. And it was because of Brad's involvement in the identification and my familiarity with Brad that I became interested in the case. It's actually rather cut and dry if you get a hold of the autopsy report conducted by Thomas Noguchi, a world-famous medical examiner, because while Sirhan unloaded his weapon with 5 shots from in front of Bobby was shot from behind. He was hit 4 times from behind, including a shot behind the right ear from only about 1.25 inches. Of course, he's correct in alluding to Sirhan having been the subject of hypnotism, where a hypnotist who boasted about working for the CIA and having hypnotized Sirhan. His behavior was methodical, his repetitious writing indicative of being under hypnosis. He was even more clearly a patsy in relation to the death of RFK than was Lee Harvey Oswald in relation to JFK. But because of the effort by Jefferson Morley and David Talbot to figure out whether there was any evidence to support that Joanides, Campbell had been, and the other had been there, I became interested in the case, talked with Bradley, looked at the various evidence. Not only was Bradley identified, Wayne Smith, who knew one of them very well. It looked to me like Jefferson Morley and David Talbot had done a pretty shoddy job of it. So I published an article, RFK outing the CIA at the Ambassador. The original date is not the same shown here. It's a long story where I ran afoul of the preferences of the senior editor at Veterans Today, where I'd been publishing 150 articles since 2011, but where he didn't want me to publish on Jane Helm. And when I published on Jane Helm, nonetheless, he took me off of Veterans Today and deleted the 150 articles I'd published there. It was such a hit to the readership of Veterans Today that the editorial board, about 6 weeks later, voted to restore them. But all the links they had around the world had been severed. It was a very neat piece of work. If you wanted to effectively take that 150 articles about JFK, 9/11, Wellstone, Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, and a host of other issues out of the complex that constitutes the internet and its network of connections. In any case, I went through all of the evidence that was available to Morley and Talbot in relation to the identification of Morales, Joanides, and Campbell. And it turned out there were many, many more witnesses who identified them than they acknowledge, and which it would appear Jim DiEugenio doesn't understand or appreciate. For example, Wayne Smith identified one of them as David Morales. David Radburn identified the same person as Morales. Brad Ayers identified one of them as Gordon Campbell. Ed Lopez identified one of them as George Joanides. Brad Ayers identified another man as David Morales. Ratburn observed Morales interacting with Campbell. Footage shows Campbell interacting with Joanides. Dan Hardway identified one of them as George Joanides. Tom Polger identified the same man as George Joanides. Joanides' daughters did not deny the identification. Robert Walton reported Morales said he was there. Rube Carbajal partially supported what Walton supported. Chio Borja identified another of them as George Joanides. In other words, although Jefferson Morley and David Talbot, whom DiEugenio evidently esteems, have given a very false and misleading report about the amount of evidence testimony substantiating that 3 CIA agents were observed at the Ambassador the night that Bobby was shot. I find all this very embarrassing, not for me, but for DiEugenio, who once again has not done his homework. If he understands that I had published that article, RFK outing the CIA at the Ambassador, then he should have known all of the evidence that substantiates my position and contradicts his. Now, DiEugenio goes on and says, I put them in their place so many times, I haven't seen where they've laid a glove on me. Me to journalist Mike Mosdale in 2006 when he was writing a very extensive story for City Pages, a publication in Minneapolis, St. Paul. According to DiEugenio, the above quote shows an almost astonishing lack of perspective and self-reflection. As we have seen in this relatively concise review of his public career, Jim Fetzer has had more gloves laid on him than a wealthy woman at a Gucci store in Beverly Hills. From endorsing the likes of John Hankey and Phil Nelson, to failing to reveal the full story about the death of Gary Webb, to advocating the wildly fantastic tales of Judy Wood, Morgan Reynolds, and John Lear about 9/11, to failing to see that the CIA would not need to fake a family in the RFK case, since the photos are not of CIA officers at the Ambassador. The reader can see that Fetzer has apparently lost his bearing on what constitutes evidence in high-profile crimes of state, to the point that one really does not know what to make of the man today. In addition to being ejected from Spartacus Educational, He was also ejected from Deep Politics Forum and let go from Veterans Today for the decision to ban him from DPF. Click here. About the last departure from Veterans Today, it's quite a negative achievement to be terminated by an editor, Gordon Duff, because he has admitted that a lot of their work at VT is made up. Well, here it goes, exaggerating, distorting. Gordon has admitted a lot of his work has been made up. If I, who am a dedicated truth seeker and a highly accomplished scholar, have differences with Gordon Duff, it's not difficult to sort out which of us is in the right and which of us is in the wrong. I was ejected from the education forum for sticking up for Judith Very Baker, which is completely absurd. I championed her in one of the longest threads in the history of the education forum. It had more than 2,000 entries. I was ejected from the Deep Politics Forum for sticking up for Phil Nelson and his arguments about LBJ having been the mastermind of the JFK assassination. On all these points, I am correct. And if, in addition, I was faulted on the education forum for standing up for Ralph Sinkay, that's because, as we have already demonstrated, Ralph was exactly right. The man in the doorway was Lee Harvey Oswald. He had the genius to recognize it was the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, the T-shirt that could establish that it was Lee Oswald right off the bat, and where Larry Rivera has cemented the deal by establishing that even the face is the face of Lee Harvey Oswald, not that of Billy Lovelady. So if you want to go back and see whether or not Jim DiEugenio, for example, has laid a glove on me, I assert here categorically, he has not. Now, here he continues. What has been Fetzer's reaction to all these people turning their backs on him? He has doubled down on his extremism. He now says that the deaths at Sandy Hook were part of a FEMA exercise. In other words, no one actually died. It was part of a plot to further gun control in America. What about the Boston Marathon bombing? That was faked also. Well, let me make a point about all these people turning their backs. One of the most interesting conversations I ever had with Gordon Duff, who has a very deep background in intelligence and disinformation ops, was the following. I said, Gordon, I think that 50% of those in the JFK research community are working the other side of the street. And Gordon replied to me, no, Jim, it's 90%. So it's not surprising that if truth tellers who are doing serious research, such as Ralph Sinkay, Judith Baker, and Phil Nelson, are going to be shunned by those who want to suppress that Lyndon Johnson was a pivotal player, want to suppress that Lee Oswald was caught in a famous photograph taken by James Ike Alchin, even though that conclusion was drawn long ago as by Harold Weisberg in the second volume of his Whitewash series, and even by Jim Garrison, on whom DiEugenio poses as an expert. Look at the evidence I presented and assess the situation. These groups have opposed me and Ralph Sinkay and Phil Nelson on completely inappropriate grounds. They have distorted our position. For the most part, they have suppressed the evidence, the kind of evidence I've been presenting here, where even Judith demonstrated that the photograph of Billy Lovelady in the checkered shirt, when you compare the left sleeve with the left sleeve of the shirt Oswald was wearing, provides a closer match to the shirt worn by Doorman than does a Billy Lovelady shirt, even though Robert Groden was hired by the HSCA as a special consultant and reported back to them precisely the opposite, reinforcing the false claim that it was Billy Lovelady in the doorway, even though he went to the FBI on 29 February 1964, showing them the shirt he was wearing at the time. That was the whole point of the exercise. It was a short sleeve red and white vertically striped shirt, which bore no resemblance whatsoever to the man in the doorway. That's how underhanded these people that we are dealing with here have become. Jim DiEugenio is a cheerleader for a host of ops and disinformation agents who are seeking to suppress the truth. He continues here. Later, he switched horses and now said no one died there and it was all a FEMA exercise. He seemed to have basis on a dubious document saying that a FEMA exercise would be conducted at the elementary school in December 2012. Unfortunately, as with Gregory Douglas, this document has been shown to be almost certainly a hoax. And as with Gregory Douglas, it was apparently manufactured by people who have a history of doing things of this kind. That would be bad enough, but it's not the whole story. When SAS Keith Johnson, who is specialized in studying Sandy Hook, alerted Fetzer that he was associating himself with manufactured evidence, Fetzer refused to change his position. Well, Keith Johnson happens to be one of the leading shills and phonies in relation to Sandy Hook research, which Jim DiEugenio would understand if he were capable of telling the difference. As far as the original story I published, based upon evidence available at the time, which Gordon Duff shared with me, it looked as though there'd been a three-man hit team, that they'd been traced in a white van back to Greenwich Village to a safe house there that was loaded with Nazi paraphernalia and other artifacts. It became rather clear in the meanwhile that that was a mistaken conception, that indeed the evidence substantiated that it had been a FEMA drill. We have the bona fide document. There is no doubt about it. As I'm going to demonstrate, that document is only one piece of a massive evidence where I published a 425-page book, which has 13 contributors, including 6 PhD, current or retired college professors, and 7 other contributors. We have established a huge amount of evidence that the school had been closed by 2008, that there were no students there for Adam Lanza to have shot, that it was an elaborate exercise, a FEMA drill to promote gun control. Let me give you a brief review of the evidence. The governor of Connecticut gave a talk, a press conference the afternoon of the purported shooting, in the company of the lieutenant governor, where he explained that he and the lieutenant governor had been spoken to that something like this might happen, which got me to wondering, spoken to by whom? And something like this, what could he possibly mean? There are only really 2 alternatives. One is that he'd been warned that someone might go berserk and come into a Connecticut school and shoot up a bunch of kids, in which case he had the obvious obligation to alert the school system to elevate their level of security to ensure it did not happen, which, however, he did not do. Or alternatively, that he'd been informed they were going to take an abandoned school, they were going to conduct a drill and present it as a live event to promote gun control, which is exactly what happened. And when I looked into the question of by whom he had been spoken to, it turns out that the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, met with Governor Malloy on the 27th of November. That's just a couple of weeks and a couple of days before the events at Sandy Hook. No doubt it was Eric Holder who informed them they were going to take an abandoned school, conduct a drill, and present it as a live event. Indeed, we even have footage of Eric Holder addressing a National Democratic Women Convention in Washington, D.C. as long ago as 1995, where, and this is his word, we have to brainwash the American people to change their attitudes about guns. Sandy Hook appears to have been their masterstroke by designing a simulated event that would have maximal emotional impact by maintaining that 20 children had been killed at an elementary school in Connecticut. The fact is there were many anomalies from the beginning. There was a sign, for example, saying everyone must check in. That's very peculiar. There were boxes of bottled water and pizza cartons at the firehouse. Again, that's very peculiar. There were porta potties already in position from the beginning. Again, that's very peculiar. There were name tags, personnel coming in with name tags that were color-coded. Those who are familiar with the FEMA procedures understand that's a standard procedure. They use color codes to identify different players. There were parents bringing children to the event. Does anyone serious believe that a parent would bring a child to the event of an actual child shooting massacre? No, the fact of the matter is this was all happening on the day of the rehearsal, the 13th. The rehearsal was on the 13th, going live on the 14th. There was so much confusion about the dates that many web's donation sites were set up already on the 13th, the day before the shooting. Even Adam Lanza, the purported shooter, was reported to have died on the 13th in the Social Security Death Index, making his feat in shooting 20 children and half a dozen adults the following day all the more remarkable. We have hundreds of photographs of the school inside and out. It was in decrepit condition. There's no way in which this was a functioning or operating school. Here's a nice illustration. The school was not compliant with Americans for Disability Act requirements that would have had to be implemented by 2008. Here is a wooden exit that is obviously not wheelchair navigable. And there's a piece of steel pipe extruding that could have popped out the eye of a little kid. This was a kindergarten to a fourth grade school. There was all kinds of storage inside the building. It was loaded with asbestos and other biohazards. Here's where you can see storage pushed right up against the windows of a classroom. Anyone who thinks this was a functioning school simply hasn't looked at the evidence. Now, here's another photograph from that day that is interesting in several different respects. Notice, first of all, there is none of that familiar white and blue painted parking areas or white and blue signage stating handicap parking permit required. Violators will be fined. It's not there. This is indicative and further proof that the school was closed by 2008. Look at the vehicles there. I'll show you another photograph where you see the parking instructions require that you come down Dickinson Drive, take a right, curl around, and then if you're going to park, you park facing away from the school. But it was so much more convenient just to bring the vehicles in a single line and fill them in. After all, they were only going to serve as props for a staged event. Who would even notice? And if you look at the building, and here's a better view where you can see that parking instruction where you drive up around and then park facing away, and yet we have all the vehicles parked facing the building. Notice there's no heat or steam coming up from the building. That's because having been abandoned since 2008, the boilers were not functional. They couldn't heat the school. The ground temperature that day was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. If children had been there, the school would have been heated. You would have seen steam and heat rising from the building. But none of that is the case because the school was closed, indeed, for many years before this event, and there were no children there. Now, here's a famous photograph taken by the Newtown Bee associate editor and photographer Shannon Hicks. This was sent around the world, published on the front page of virtually every newspaper in the world. It was supposed to be a photograph of a policewoman escorting a group of kids away from Sandy Hook during the emergency. It was normally published in a crop fashion, so you didn't see this figure on the left, on the far left. Well, it turns out there was a second photograph taken that day. In fact, this one appears to have been taken before the other, where there's a whole string of parents there. There's a whole string of parents there. What do you think? During this shooting emergency, somebody got on the phone and said, I think we better get a lot of parents down here. What are those parents doing there? They're completely nonchalant, arms folded, lack of concern. Moreover, look at this. They changed the order of the children in the sequence. Look at the bottom. The first figure among the children is a little girl in a pink sweater and a short skirt. But look in the second photograph, the one sent round to the world. It's a little boy in a black sweater and blue jeans. They move the children around to get a better shot. And if you look in between in the bottom, between the arrow for boy number 2 and boy number 1, there are a couple of parents there who are casually looking on, leading me to describe them as lounging at the massacre. This is absolute proof. This was a staged event. These were fake photographs. They were posed. They even rearranged the kids to get a better shot. Now, if there had been an actual bona fide evacuation, according to the final report from Danbury State's Attorney Stephen Sedinsky, there should have been 489 students in school that day. If you subtract 20 for those who were supposed to have been killed, you'd have 469 who needed to be evacuated. It would look something like this. It would have been those strings of children with an adult supervisor all over the place. But guess what? We have looked at the dash cam footage for the actual locations and times when the police insist that the evacuation was taking place. And guess what? No one is there. No one is there. Now, you've sometimes heard the argument that you cannot prove a negative, but you can prove the negative that there's no elephant in your living room by going to your living room and looking for the presence of elephant. If there's no presence of elephant, you're entitled to infer that is because there's no elephant there. If you go to the locations and times where the evacuation was alleged to have been taking place, and you find there are no children or adults there, you're entitled to infer that's because no evacuation was taking place. Now, DiEugenio probably doesn't understand the point I've just made, but most rational students would appreciate because it's decisive. There was no evacuation because there were no students there, because the school had been closed by 2008. It was filled with asbestos and other biohazards. We also have in the book, Nobody Died at Sandy Hook, a series of photographs of them furnishing the Lanza home, which appears to have been empty. It was a home in a high real estate value area, yet they brought in a lot of inexpensive furniture. You can find in chapter 7, Adam Lanza's room neat, Adam Lanza's room messy, Adam Lanza's room bed made, Adam Lanza's room bed unmade. They were trying to figure out which would be the best way to present it to the public. Here we have the Nancy Lanza bedroom. According to the official account, Adam Lanza shot his mother 4 times in the head with a single-shot .22 caliber rifle. There's some red stuff on the bed, but it isn't blood, and it's not in copious quantity. It looks to me as though it might be raspberry jam. Look at the wooden chest. There are forms there we find on many of the other photographs because they were keeping records of exactly how they were furnishing the home. And Kelly Watt, who had over 100 hours of conversation with Noah Posner, who claims to be the father of Noah, a most unusual little boy, because Noah not only is reported to have died in Sandy Hook, but also 2 years later to have died again in Pakistan, and where Kelly explained to Lenny she didn't believe a word he said. She didn't believe he had a son. She didn't believe he died, and where he sent her a copy of a death certificate that turns out to be a fabrication with a bona fide lower half but a fake top that has no file number and the wrong estimated time of death, because it claims it's 11 a.m. when all the shooting took place between 9:30 and 9:35. Kelly has her own commercial in home cleaning service, and her keen eye spotted that beneath the leg of that bed, there's a blue moving pad that in their haste they forgot to remove. We also have a series of 50 photographs of them refurbishing the school to serve as a stage. We have photographs of the moving vans. We have photographs of the nameplate on the classroom, still has a moving tag on it. This is Exhibit 26. I regard this as a piece de resistance, the most decisive proof this whole thing was an elaborate fraud. Notice, the SWAT team vehicle is already there. Just above the top of the SWAT vehicle toward the front, there's a series of 4 windows in classroom 10. They are undamaged. That means the event has not taken place yet because they would later be presented as having one of them in particular shot out, as I'm going to explain. The flag is at full mast. There's crime scene tape up for a crime that is yet to be committed. And just below the flag, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, awaiting the arrival of his portable mortuary tent, is none other than Wayne Carver, the medical examiner. Here are 4 additional photographs. You can see the windows undamaged at the top left. Then you can see the windows damaged at the top right. Notice in particular the second is seriously damaged. The lower left, we actually have a photograph of the perps drilling holes in the window frame to simulate bullet holes. And look at the lower right. We have pink rods that are intended to illustrate the trajectories of those rounds. They're all exactly 90-degree angles to the window pane and perfectly parallel. Now, I used to supervise recruit training at Edson Range Camp Pendleton when I was a series commander in the Marine Corps and had 15 DIs and 300 recruits under my command. This is a ridiculous fabrication of shooting. No real shots would create these kinds of trajectories that were all perfectly parallel. This is a complete and total fraud. Here we have a close-up where you can see that it is Wayne Carver. You can see the crime scene tape up for a crime that is yet to be committed. Here he is again, even up more closely. It was Wayne Carver who, the following day, did the heavy lifting by claiming he had done autopsies on all of these children in a remarkably brief span of time, though he couldn't remember how many were boys and how many were girls, nor the caliber of the weapon that allegedly had performed this astounding feat. Fascinatingly, InfoWars, which is a website, as a part of the Alex Jones operation, actually published this photograph in an even more clear version, which you see here. Notice the undamaged windows just above the SWAT team vehicle. Notice the flag at full mast. Notice the crime scene tape up for a crime that is yet to be committed. Notice Wayne Carver there with his arms folded, awaiting the arrival of his portable mortuary tent. I think the reason why this article was only up for 38 minutes and why it was taken down, even though it had 178 comments, is the image credit. Look at that. Image credits, Connecticut State Police. The Connecticut police were documenting everything they were doing, never expecting it would fall into the public domain where it constitutes proof of their cooperation in an elaborate hoax on the American people. I now have 3 books about these events. Nobody Died at Sandy Hook, a new book, and Nobody Died in Boston Either, where I'll address the claims by Jim DiEugenio that I don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to Boston either. And then, of course, the original, the first in the series, and I suppose we didn't go to the moon either, which is quite fascinating because it includes 100 pages about the moon landing hoax. It includes 100 pages about the death and replacement of Paul McCartney, which interestingly appears to have taken place around the date of 9/11/1966, when Paul appears to have died, either accidentally or by being taken out. It has 2 chapters on the first death of Saddam Hussein, another 2 chapters on the second death of Osama bin Laden, and then 4 chapters on the Holocaust. Now, to the best of my knowledge, Jim DiEugenio has never done any research on these subjects. He doesn't know anything about Sandy Hook. He doesn't know anything about the Boston bombing. He doesn't know anything about Paul McCartney. He doesn't know anything about the Holocaust. So I'm going to do my best to cover the Boston bombing, Paul McCartney, and the Holocaust in what I hope will be the 7th and final installment of my response to his ridiculous attack, which I think it should be clear by now has no basis, no substance, no foundation whatsoever. It's as though he looked for my foremost critics in different areas and then brought them together, completely uncritically accepting anything they had to say, When you talk about Keith Johnson, for example, I did a 2-hour debate with him, and he never got over the fact that I defeated him. I've done 2-hour debates with many others about Sandy Hook as well. And you can find it online. Dave Gahary was the host. Keith Johnson is a part of a band that not only consists of Lenny Posner, but also a fellow named C.W. Wade, who have been going about attacking websites for those who have been involved in exposing the hoax at Sandy Hook. What is particularly interesting about Lenny Posner is that there's a tenured professor at Florida Atlantic University by the name of James Tracy, who published the first really scholarly article about Sandy Hook, addressing the anomalies in the press conference held by Wayne Carver, the medical examiner, the morning of 14 December 2012, pointing out how many strange aspects there were to it, where Wayne Carver, even at one point, observes he hopes this doesn't come crashing down on the people of Newtown. No doubt self-conscious and aware he was playing a fraudulent role, namely that of the medical examiner in an elaborate production called Sandy Hook, where you can find a nice piece on YouTube I put together entitled Sandy Hook, starring Wayne Carver as the medical examiner. Check it out. Now, I've reported we have 13 contributors to this book, including 6 PhD, current or retired college professors. I myself had published 30 articles about Sandy Hook before I put it together, having ample opportunity to straighten out any mistakes I might have made along the way, including having been mistaken about the early signs that it had been a Mossad hit. It's actually not that much of a stretch if you understand, for example, that the IDF makes a sport of picking off Palestinian children. They seem to have a competition among themselves to see which of them can murder the most number of children in Palestine. It's completely outrageous, but there it is. So the thought that this could have been an op by a Mossad group was not far-fetched. But as soon as I discovered evidence that it had been a hoax, I abandoned that hypothesis, which was no longer tenable. That's the action of a rational mind, of a serious scholar. When you encounter new evidence, you adjust your beliefs. If you have a new hypothesis, new data, you revise, and you may be required to reject hypotheses you previously accepted, accept hypotheses you previously rejected, and leave others in suspense. That is what happened to me in the course of my Sandy Hook research. Another of my contributors, Dr. Eowyn, also a retired college professor, had published 80 articles on Sandy Hook before we published the book. And after Amazon banned the book, it was so obvious to me that this was a political event, because the only explanation they gave to me for banning the book was that I should review the guidelines. But the book had already passed all their guidelines when it was initially published on 22 October. It had sold nearly 500 copies by the 19th of November when it was banned. And I recognized what was going on and immediately released it for free to the public as a PDF. Now, in the meanwhile, we have found ourselves a new printer and distributor, because originally it was published with CreateSpace, which is a subsidiary of Amazon.com. So when Amazon.com banned it, I lost my source of copies of the book, but I have found a new source, and we now distribute all 3 of these books through moonrockbooks.com, which you can find online. Interestingly, the White House press secretary, Jay Carney, had left that position and gone to Amazon.com to become senior vice president. I have no doubt that he played a role in having the book banned, because it blows the official story of Sandy Hook completely out of the water. One of our contributors, for example, Paul Preston, was a Los Angeles area superintendent of schools who's actually supervised events of this kind, and he was so disturbed by what he saw that he reached out to his contacts in the Obama Department of Education, all of whom confirmed to him that it had been a drill, that no children had died, and that it was done to promote gun control. Because this whole situation was so contrived and so outrageous, where Barack Obama seized the opportunity to, on January 16th, 2013, thus a month and 2 days later, signed no less than 23 executive orders to curtail Americans' access to weapons, even though it's guaranteed to us by the Second Amendment, which he has been violating his oath to preserve, protect, and defend from all enemies, foreign and domestic. In my judgment, he deserves to be impeached. But there are many other indications of fraud here, including, for example, that the many other shootings have been staged with a targeted audience. In the case of Sandy Hook, they were targeting parents. They were trying to contrive an emotionally laden effect. The idea that 20 children had been killed at a school where all of the participants have benefited immensely from what turns out to be an act of feigned terror. The classic definition of terrorism is an act of violence intended to instill fear into a target audience to make it more amenable to manipulation to promote a political agenda. After 9/11, the government realized that it was easier to fake these events, to stage them using actors of one kind or another, than to actually kill people, because it could lead to unexpected consequences. For example, in the wake of 9/11, 4 women who were widows of men who died in New York City formed the Jersey Girls and put pressure on the Bush-Cheney administration to appoint a 9/11 commission, which they deferred doing for 441 days. When they finally appointed the commission, they only arranged to testify themselves if they could come in together, if they could testify not under oath, and if it could be done with no transcript being kept. You would have thought we were talking about the interrogation of 2 mafia dons rather than the president and the vice president of the United States. They have made it a practice ever since to use actors or scripted players. In the case of Sandy Hook, it appears to have been a lot of do-gooders who are willing to feign the role of being parents, some of whom have been dramatically exposed. For example, a fellow named David Wheeler not only played the role of an aggrieved parent, but also that of a law enforcement official walking up and down Dickinson Drive in camouflage garb, carrying an AR-15 upside down by the magazine. Anyone with any experience with weapons will indicate that is someone who has no experience whatsoever. He has been outed in a brilliant expose by Barry Soretto. Online, you can find David Wheeler Busted, where he and his wife were flown to Washington, D.C., and given the opportunity to give an address from the White House about what else? Gun control by Barack Hussein Obama. The whole thing is a complete outrage, and where I even included a study as an appendix showing that when guns are banned, crime goes up. The very first study reported there is in England and Wales, where when they banned guns, crime climbed so dramatically that after 4 or 5 months, they had to double the number of bobbies on the street. In other words, the only way they could contain it was by putting more guns on the street. And if you stop and think about it, isn't it obvious that when guns are banned, crime will go up, because then the burglars, the criminals, they're not going to surrender their weapons. They'll have the freedom to know that at least if they break into your home, suppose you put a sign out that said gun-free zone, and you begin to get the idea, they know they're not going to be confronted by an armed household. And where we know now it takes an average of 20 minutes for the police to respond to an emergency call. Since the mayhem takes place principally in the first 5 minutes, if you cannot defend yourself, when the police show up 20 minutes later, it may be too late. Your daughter may be raped, your wife may be mugged, you may be dead. We have to be able to defend ourselves, especially in a situation where the Obama administration is populated by neoconservatives who are trying to provoke a war with Russia. If they succeed, the first cities to go will be Washington, D.C. and New York City. We'll have a country without a government, the situation well portrayed in the television series Jericho, which any of you who have followed will realize, where the only way communities can protect themselves from marauding gangs who out to rape and loot and steal is if they happen to be armed. The whole gun control business is bizarre. It's misconceived. It has a great deal of damage, and it's unconstitutional. Think about it when we return next week with what I expect to be the final installment. I'll talk about the Boston bombing, Paul McCartney, and I'll explain why that case is so important, and the Holocaust. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal. Thank you all for watching.